Gyeongsang National, part of the Gyeongsang National University SSK Research Cluster on Post-Capitalism and the innovation of Marxism, future for East Asia in the global context. That's a broad research cluster under which these different presentations are being held for some years now. Okay. So today our speaker is Professor Pranab Kanti Basu, uh, a very well-known Marxist in India, a Marxist professor and writer. Uh, he uh, he he hails from he was involved in Ashutosh College for decades actually, and then he went on to become professor at Visva-Bharati University. So that is his academic credential. But he's also very well known for uh, he's written a lot in both national and international journals, including in Bengali, which is his main language. Uh, uh, Pranab Kanti Basu, or Pranab Da, as we is known to us, uh, has written one of the most important book, in my opinion, uh, in that at least I have come across in the 21st century. It is called Globalization and Anti-Text. I say this because, as I found out, some of the major concepts laid down there were actually uh, discussed later on by many other. That's a very important book which Professor Basu had written, came out in which was published by Akar Books. Today's talk, Pranabda's talk will be on hegemony, populism, and the paradox of fundamentalism. Uh, Hegemony, populism, fundamentalism, all these three things are not just Indian matters any longer. They are global concerns as far as Marxists are, as far we Marxists go and the Marxist space goes. How do we confront these three elements and, you know, which seem to be over us uh, at the same time? So Pranab Kanti Basu is going to talk today on this, which he has been thinking for some times now, and he will share his thoughts. So, uh, Professor Basu, you are going to talk for 50 minutes, around 50 minutes. Is that okay?
Okay, I think I should be able to finish by that.
Okay, around that. And then we will have a
Uh,
discussion on that, based on that lecture. So you can start.
okay, thank you for the very generous introduction, Anjan. I don't know how far I deserve that, but anyway, uh, I will be reading out mainly from a prepared text because of this time constraint. This topic which I have chosen, and I thank the organizers that they have uh, allowed me to proceed with this topic. And I would love to love to hear the opinions on this because I plan to develop this project into a full-fledged book. So in a sense, these are very preliminary thoughts, and because of the fact that there are a lot of issues involved, as Anjan has correctly pointed out, I will be reading from a prepared text so that there is no wastage of time. So let me get on to it. Uh, can that slide be seen? Can you see the slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Uh, we will first briefly outline our theoretical understanding of the socio-psychological processes of hegemony, populism, and fundamentalism. We will then deploy these tools for analyzing the history and current dominance of religious fundamentalism in India. In this practical project, we will propose a symbiosis between the socio-psychological processes of fundamentalism and political economy. The hegemonic and populist processes are, in my view, and it's not very original, they are very similar, if not identical, in their analytical character. Fundamentalism of course, is a variety of populism. The need for cultural domination over a large block of classes, both for maintaining power and for overthrowing an existing regime of power, was articulated probably first by Marx in the German ideology. The culture control was named hegemony by Gramsci, who also popularized the idea. He also proposed the distinction between two sets of instruments deployed by the ruling bloc for maintaining power, the coercive and the persuasive. The coercive was administered by political society, by which he meant what we usually class as part of state organs like police, judiciary, jails, etc. The persuasive strategies were administered through civil society organs that included schools, churches, families, etc. Persuasion is the dominant means of maintaining power if the ruling bloc enjoys hegemonic control. Now, how does the hegemony work? I can persuade you to do something if you feel that this something is desirable for you. So the hegemonic project requires that the hegemon should project her agenda as a universal, even if a bad universal, rather than as just a particular serving its own personal needs. The process of hegemony was given uh, conceptual depth by Laclau and Mouffe in Hegemony and Populist Socialism and Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, and also by Laclau on populist on what was that? Populist reason. Now they inaugurated the idea of chain of equivalence and empty signifier or floating signifier. That is a signifier that is not attached to any single signified, even ignoring the deconstructionist critique of correspondence as such. Such signifiers like liberty, fraternity, or equality mean different things to different people and thus can unify various groups with divergent interests. In treating populism and hegemony as conceptually similar, we are following the logic of Laclau and Mouffe. It's argued that populism has some specific traits that distinguish it from the hegemonic project in general. But these traits are conceptually indistinct. That is what I feel. According to most, populism has a charismatic leader, but as Laclau interprets, the leader could be iconic, like Gandhi, say. In fact, the populist leader is bound to be iconic, a fetish object in whose glory the people consign their gratification. The leader then becomes a floating signifier. Some identify populism, on the other hand, with anti elitism, and some with the mob. But none of these are essential, as a populist leader like Modi can well command the allegiance of the yuppies as well. I agree with Laclau and Mouffe that there is no universal class, unlike what orthodox Marxists espouse, though this orthodox position was also endorsed by Marx in certain texts like the economic and philosophic manuscripts. And I quote from this: the supersession of private property is, therefore, the complete emancipation of all human senses and qualities. But it is this emancipation precisely in that these senses and qualities, have become human, both subjectively and objectively. The eye has become a human eye when its object has become a social human object produced by man and destined for him. Thus, in practice, the senses have become direct theoreticians. This is important. In the same way, I can appropriate the senses and enjoyments of other men. Close quote. Now, there is an obvious thing here, as we know since the elaboration of semiotics by Saussure. There is always intervention of culture and science systems in the process of cognition. The senses cannot ever become direct theoreticians, and neither can I, appropriate the senses and enjoyments of other men, unless I take the Hegelian position that I am the singular, the manifest absolute. Without a universal class, a populist front has to emerge or be engineered, whether for maintaining power or for challenging it, that is, for counter hegemony, whatever be its class core. In other words, the representation of a particular has to exceed its particularity and present itself rhetorically as a universal. In fact, it is a necessity for maintaining any degree of stability in any social order and for overthrowing the order. This is politics, as Laclau sees it. There is thus no conceptual difference between the hegemonic strategy and the populist project if there is no universal class. If there was a universal class, say the working class, in whom human emancipation is embodied, paradoxically, in the socialist revolution, there would not be a need for any real hegemonic process, as hegemony would be a natural phenomenon. This is how I think Orthodox Marxism views the working class position. Thus, to them, assumption of power by the working class signifies the end of history, a restoration of the identity of nature and culture. As we see it, every hegemonic process is built around a projected universal, which is false and yet necessary. It is this orthodox faith, Orthodox Marxist faith, that has rendered the hegemonic project insignificant from the position of Marxist parties in India in general. This, in spite of Marx's exhortation in the German ideology, about the importance of counter hegemony. Fundamentalism is a particular kind of hegemonic process or populist process that is built on the idea of the true people, those who consider themselves the legitimate people of a territory may constitute a hegemonic bloc with this identity as the binding principle, that is, the false universal. The commonest brand of populism is religious fundamentalism, where the majoritarian religion is preached as the identity of the true people, those who have a proper claim to a territory. There can be other brands like linguistic fundamentalism. There is also a connotation of purity attached to the true people. Now, Hadith in the Routledge Handbook of Global Populism has differentiated between what he terms as three theoretical approaches to the understanding of the process of populism: discursive approach, ideational approach, and the organizational approach. First, the discursive approach, by which he means Laclau's analytical method, the use of empty signifiers to understand the process of creating chains of equivalence or solidarity between different groups of discontents. Secondly, the ideational approach, where the emphasis is on the ideas and rhetoric, especially of populist movement leaders. And lastly, the organizational approach that focuses on the vehicles and strategies of populist movements and their circumvention by established institutions of representation. We borrow this scheme, tweaking it in several ways. First, we are uncomfortable with classifying the discursive approach as one of the approaches, inasmuch as hegemony has to always do with social psyche. While it is possible to disagree with Laclau's omnibus application of empty signifier and chain of equivalence to analyze hegemony, one cannot analyze the process of hegemony or populism without proposing how the social psyche of diverse groups of people undergo transformation to produce a conjunctural psychological feeling of oneness. Any analytic of a psychic process must be discursive, as, following Lacan, we can say that our thought processes are structured like linguistic processes. We are one with Laclau when he argues that the populist strategy involves rhetorically projecting a particular difference or identity in difference as the universal. We propose that the chain of equivalence established through the play of empty signifier overcoming differences and the ideational unity transcending differences are just different modes of psychic operation, that is, different rhetorical modes of becoming of the false universal. This is a point of departure from Laclau because he talks only of the rhetorical project of constructing chain of equivalence, whereas we are bringing in the question of ideational transcendence. We will argue that Gandhian populism, which gripped the nationalist movement, worked through an empty signifier and chain of equivalence, while the majoritarian fundamentalism of Hindutva, that is, the basis of popular support for the current ruling regime in India, projects an ideational unity. This latter has to define an identity in difference, a particular, that is Hindu, and then proceed rhetorically to project this as a universal by dismantling some of the differences, but always sharpening the others, say non-Muslim. That is, it has to dismantle certain differences, which we will elaborate as we go on, like the marginalized, the outcasts, etc. This simultaneous project of dissolution and sharpening is a source of internal fracture of a populist theme, of the populist theme. An example would be the demand for the inclusion of Shorno religion in the census survey. This is a demand that has been raised by tribal groups who do not want to be identified as Hindu. Secondly, instead of treating, first of all, the discursive approach is common to all ideas of populism, all analysis of populism. That is what we argue. Secondly, instead of treating these as analytical approaches, we will treat them as ontological processes of mobilization. That is the discursive approach and the ideational approach. Thirdly, the organizational approach, which of course is situated at a lower conceptual plane as it deals with the material tools rather than with the psychic process. This is modified to refer to the deployment of the entirety of civil society organs that Gramsci talks of, instead of being just, as Hadis says, the vehicles that circumvent the established institutions of representation. If a populist regime is in power, as it is in India today, it can well use the organs of civil society that are in consonance with the established institutions of civil society. It doesn't always have to circumvent them. We bring to the table something more than just culture and psyche, the two axes along which the process of hegemony, populism, and fundamentalism have generally been discussed. We attempt to link the revival of majoritarian fundamentalism in India to India's political economy. The majoritarian religious fundamentalism in India, which is Hindutva, is ideational, the idea being that of the Hindu Rashtra or state. The populism of Gandhi, which was the dominant populism during the freedom struggle against the British, was discursive in Laclau's sense, Gandhi being the empty signifier. The recent successful revival of Hindutva we attribute partially to organizational populism and partly to the current context in which the idea of aggressive Hindutva can offer a substitute gratification to the economically deprived masses. Garv se bolo hum Hindu. Proclaim proudly that you are a Hindu. This is what we mean by substitute gratification. That is, we can constitute an ideation, it can constitute an ideational unity. It is also partially attributable to the emergence of a popular leader representing the unrepresentable masses. From its Hindutva as defined by, this was first probably defined by Brahmabandhu Upadhyay in Bengal and later by Savarkar, is Hinduism distorted in two fundamental ways to suit the modernist enterprise of inventing nationalism. First, It was complemented with the virility of the Christian church. And secondly, Hinduism's diverse philosophies were repressed to reduce it to the caste-based Brahminical ideas. From its inception, Hindutva defined Islam rather than the West or British colonialism as its other. Upadhyay ultimately became a Catholic, wearing Hindu sannyasi's saffron robe. Brahmabandhav's aggressive evangelism, the strange attire of saffron-robed ascetic with a rosary, and his claim of combining Hindu and Catholic traditions indicated his search for a cultural spiritual peg for a macho nationalism to fight British colonialism. Hinduism, with its pluralism and non-proselytizing character, was seen as inadequate to the task of constructing a nationalism that could counter colonialism. I quote from Brahma Bandhav, by birth we are Hindu and shall remain Hindu till death. We are Hindus so far as our physical and mental constitution is concerned. But in regard to our immortal souls, we are Catholic. We are Hindu Catholic. Similarly, Savarkar says in The Essentials of Hindutva, and I quote, the Vedic state based on and backed up by the Vedic church, mind you, the Vedic church, must be designated by the Vedic name, and so far as it was then possible, identified with the Vedic lines. So you see, he's talking of a Vedic church. Hinduism does not have any such unifying structure as the church. Hinduism being a set of diverse philosophies, belonging was defined in practice by adherence to Brahminical rituals. Brahmabandhav and Savarkar, as well as most Hindu state movement leaders who succeeded them, openly professed their faith in the Brahminical caste system. I quote from The Essentials of Hinduism by Savarkar. You see, when we talk of the Brahminical system, the ancient texts of the Hindu religion, which are considered the ancient texts, Vedas, Brahmanas, the Aranyaks, and the Upanishads. These are divided into two parts. One, which is called the Gyan Kand, that is to do with knowledge, and the other is the Karma Kand, that is to do with practices. And only the Brahmanas deal with the Karma Kand, and this is what was adopted as, this was what is popularly seen as Hinduism. And to quote from Savarkar, and thus we find the institutions that were the peculiar marks of our nation was revived. The system of four varnas, which could not be wiped away even under the Buddhistic sway, even in popularity, grew in popularity to such an extent that kings and emperors felt it a distinction to be called one who established the system of four varnas. Reaction in favor of this institution grew so strong that our nationality was almost getting identified with it. This is how Savarkar presents the ascent of Hinduism after the decline of Buddhism in The Essentials of Hindutva. This deeply divisive system, that is the caste system, the Varna system, excluded the outcasts, tribals, and all reformist religions like Buddhism, Sikhism, and many smaller sects. This we can see as an inevitable internal fracture between the particular identity and its false projection as a universal, which I've already talked of. In the attempt to achieve a hegemonic hold on the masses, Savarkar invented a pseudo-history of the Hindu people so as to include all these excluded people, barring the Muslims and practitioners of other religions of the book. This is the false universal to overcome the exclusivity, the difference of Brahmanism with the universal of a mythical historical block called Hindutva. This hegemonic project failed in the face of Gandhism during the nationalist movement for two reasons. First, Gandhism was defined in opposition to Western and particularly British ways. And secondly, because the iconic figure of Gandhi meant different things to different people, That is, Gandhi was a floating signifier. In a sense, in that sense, Gandhism exceeded Gandhi, and this is discussed in great detail by Partho Chatterjee. The amorphous intent behind the anti-British struggle resulted after independence. The amorphous intent because it was Gandhi, the floating signifier who unified the nationalist struggle, resulted after independence in the creation of an independent state rather than a nation. The nationalism that dominated the freedom struggle was defined only by its opposition to British colonialism. It had no positive content and so could not motivate an independent nation. The state held the fragments of the nation together. It had to perform various balancing acts, but none of these signified, sorry, that the state was autonomous of class interests. What it did promote were the interests of the big bourgeoisie, monopoly houses, mainly the monopoly houses, the big landlords, and the bureaucracy. But the inability of any class set to attain a position of hegemony, as also the inability of capital to ensure its own conditions of reproduction, was reflected in statism. It has been characterized as similar to Gramsci's integral state, where the classical Western segmentation of state and civil society does not exist. The public sector provided the infrastructure and heavy industries that private capital accumulation could not build in the short run. It built an educational infrastructure that provided technical and managerial personnel for private capital at subsidized rate. From the mid-60s, it began to subsidize agriculture to promote high-yielding variety cultivation. It also provided political stability. This was partly through some directed policies, for example, the labor laws and laws relating to rights of forest dwellers. It also partially subsidized the marginalized and the refugees of development through affirmative action and later through targeted welfare schemes. But the marginalized were mainly coerced rather than persuaded through the use of state violence against these population segments whenever they voiced their discontent. Discriminatory violence was administered in various ways. First of all, it was a carryover from the harsh despotic measures of the colonial government against the poor, the minorities, and the lower castes. Secondly, the independent state also adopted new laws that excluded targeted population from means of normal judicial redressal. The independent state carried over the criminal and administrative procedures of the colonial state. And I quote from a collection of essays called The Majoritarian State. I'll give the reference at the end of the lecture. The force of colonial law was always applied in a deeply unequal manner that exposed the poor, lower caste majority of the population to the most despotic and harsh dimensions of governance and punishment. These practices were retained by the independent government. As the independent Indian government began to extend its reach into new geographical territories, it faced, the quotation has ended, as the independent Indian government began to extend its reach into new geographical territories, it faced incipient, sporadic, violent opposition. This led to further strengthening of the discriminatory apparatus of state violence. More than a dozen different paramilitary forces were formed, acts suspending normal democratic rights and judicial procedures, generally in notified regions, but for specified times, were passed. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act, UAPA, TADA, etc. At a more everyday level, the Indian police and security forces have, over the decades, developed an infamous record of systematic brutality, disappearances, systematic corruption, and a chronic lack of investigative capacity that everyday violence is almost exclusively visited upon poor and vulnerable populations, the social and religious minorities in particular. In these communities, the police force is seen as a major danger and a source of routine harassment, extortion, and unpredictable violence. State violence, which is continuous and perceived as targeted, begets retaliatory mob violence. There is a tacit admission of this rising phenomena in the continuation of additions to Indian Penal Code Chapter 8, which is titled Offences Against Public Tranquility. Again, I quote from majoritarian state, uh, open quote, being booked under one of the IPC 140s or 150s becomes in itself a form of proof of a collective sentiment and anger, and indeed a part of a political vernacular, a measure of success. Something has happened. Mob frenzy is close quote, mob frenzy is perceived as a legitimate expression of the opinions of marginalized or victimized communities. Violence became a constitutive element of the state. States discriminatory violence against minorities, the displaced refugees of development, and the poor, religious and ethnic mob violence in response, and also as expression of Fissiparous tendencies. Expansion of the scope and depth of exceptions to the rule of democratic rights, all these in combination created a polity where the rule of democratic laws and regulations appeared to be exceptions. The pervasiveness of violence indicated that the nation was an absent entity. The fragments were being held together by a violent state. But state violence itself was begetting further fragmentation of the nation. Violence of the state betrayed the lack of hegemony or ideational unity exercised by the ruling bloc represented by the Congress Party. This was revealed starkly in the imposition of internal emergency in 1975. The rise of Hindutva. The decline of the Congress and the rise of Hindutva complemented each other. Statism was the only binding principle of the Congress Party. As long as this suited the needs of the ruling bloc, Congress could retain its hold. When state participation in economic activity was no longer vital to large capital, statism lost its major ruling class support. By the 80s, big capital had accumulated sufficiently to perceive state presence in the economy as more suffocating than enabling. Liberalization, privatization, and globalization, which is derivatively called LPG, liquid petroleum gas. LPG was formally initiated in 1991, though the process had actually started from the 80s. As far as the agricultural lobby is concerned, it had been reduced to bargaining only for subsidies, with all possibility of sustaining agricultural growth, sustainable agricultural growth, eroded by the widespread adoption of Green Revolution strategy through the 70s and 80s, initially heavily subsidized by the state. The sector retained a substantial vote bank, but as the government's false promises that ended the recent farmer protests indicate, the farm lobby has lost its cohesion and clout. Perhaps the policy of mobilizing popular support through various directed benefit schemes for the poor and jobless, rather than particular sectoral aids, has dented the clout of the farm lobby, as the interests of the poor in the rural sector are delinked from the earnings of the farm sector. The working class and middle classes were opposed to the withdrawal of the state given their economic interests, but the state could afford to neglect them because of their lack of organization and failure to construct any universal or unity. Privatization was understandably opposed by the workers in public sector enterprises, but the non-unionization of a large segment of the private sector workers and perceived labor aristocracy of the public sector enterprise workers combined to thwart the movement by PSE workers, public sector enterprise workers, against privatization. Workers in the organized sector, organized private sector, and trade unions were concerned with the gradual disengagement of the state, formally and informally, from surveillance over working conditions and terms of employment. Growing casualization, legal, legal and illegal, was informally removing large chunks of the workforce from the protection of labor laws. The fear was that the state was moving in the direction of formally casualizing organized sector permanent workforce. But formal organized sector workers' opposition to such attempts was of no avail, as they failed to generate a hegemonic position even within the working class, because the majority of the workers were either employed in the unorganized sector or were informal workers in the organized sector itself. The urban middle classes searching for economic stability through government or PSE jobs remained committed to statism. This attitude is, of course, changing, with increasingly the new generation seeing greater opportunity for self aggrandizement in the disparate growth pattern and skilled job options abroad or in jobs outsourced from abroad. Initially, the middle class was a vocal and influential segment, particularly because of its professional media control. But it had little economic clout and was also divided in its political loyalties, being partially mobilized by the largest Marxist party, which practically equated statism with socialism, and mobilized partly by the Congress. The opposition to liberalization, privatization, and globalization, though massive in terms of numbers, failed to constitute any bloc. LPG ushered the beginning of a new era with fast macro growth coupled with increasing concentration of wealth and increasing economic disparity. While a few prospered, most languished. The perception of democratic deficit was further heightened by a pervasive sense of widespread economic corruption. Liberalization brought with it an ideational vacuum with the demise of statism. This was filled by the revival of Hindutva for reasons that we discuss presently. The speed of LPG, liberalization, privatization, and globalization, desired by large monopoly capital, could not be attained by either the Congress or the Vajpayee-led NDA government 1996 and 1998 to 2002, because they could not hope to retain popular support without curbing the inherent tendency of LPG towards increasing inequality. Though LPG was adopted by the Congress government, it could not single-mindedly pursue these policies, because of the diversity of interests combined under the party umbrella. This was the byproduct of Gandhism. Also, it had no ideational force that could forge a pseudo-universal that could transcend sectional deprivations. So people were being deprived, but if there was an ideational force which could still keep them united and supporting the Congress party, in spite of these deprivations brought about by LPG, then these could have been carried on. But this was not possible because there was no ideational unity within the Congress party itself. An index of this inability is a continuous failure of Congress governments in attaining the disinvestment targets. Such half-hearted liberalization marked the BJP government-led NDA and BJP-led NDA government policy under Vajpayee also. Capital could hope for the continuation of liberalization, privatization, and globalization in spite of growing income disparity, jobless growth, and attendant discontent, only if a populist government could be installed whose support base would be divorced from the economic benefit that the masses derived from its governance. This was precisely the promise held out by the aggressive Hindutva phase of the BJP government helmed by Modi. We are not arguing that the rise of Hindu fundamentalism was engineered by big capital. It had been gradually taking hold of popular consciousness for socio-cultural reasons that we indicate. But we argue that in the given conjunctural situation, a majoritarian populist state was more desirable to big capital than a liberal democratic state. The divorce of political support from economic benefit, which the new fundamentalist regime could ensure, allowed the adoption of harsh pro capital and anti people measures that capital had long been clamoring for. The Modi government has been able to change labor laws and environmental safeguards to allow capital access to unprotected labor markets, providing what it calls flexible labor and also to unprotected natural resources. Particularly, the replacement of the labor laws with labor codes that allowed the casualization of organized sector workers was opposed by all opposition parties. But the government could ignore this with impunity because it was aware that large segments of the working class too had been hegemonized by the Hindutva ideology. Hindutva also ushered in a new dimension to crony capitalism. Now, crony capitalism is not new to India. Indian industry has never been competitive. In the pre-liberalization period, the licensing policy was perverted by the political powers and bureaucracy to help monopoly capital. This has been extensively documented by government inquiry commissions like the Hazari Committee and the Dutt Committee. Indian industry, which from its inception was dominated by monopoly capitalism and cronyism, entered into a new phase of cronyism with LPG. It was new in two senses. First of all, largesse could no longer be bestowed, it could now only be bestowed by high political authority, not by bureaucracy, as was previously the case. Secondly, the beneficiaries were more concentrated. The dismantling of state industry and state-owned infrastructure offered a huge scope for crony capital. The situation, though not as frightening because the extensiveness of the state prior to liberalization was significantly less than in the former USSR, yet was similar to the industrial scene in Russia in the 90s. Insider information and cronyism were used to grab state assets like sea and airports, communication systems, defense supplies, mineral wealth, etc. This cronyism was qualitatively different from the previous form. First, unlike in the past, bureaucrats had little power to bestow the new favors, which were related to acquisition of national assets and infrastructure by cronies. The highest political authorities could only bestow such largesse. Secondly, and complementing the first, was the fact that the beneficiaries were also more concentrated. There is a common perception that the most benefited belong to the home state of the Prime Minister and Home Minister and have been their cronies since the days when they wielded power in the state. This transition culminated in the mega growth of a few capitalist cronies of the current power center. One grew from moderate beginnings to become the world's third richest person until a recent expose by a Wall Street short seller led to a partial collapse of his assets, though the government is still trying to shield him from investigation. Crony capital has, in turn, helped finance the ruling party in a major way, as data relating to electoral bonds that are in the public domain show. So, apart from the complex symbiotic interdependence or overdetermination of the relation between cronism, the new cronism, and the ruling party, there is a straightforward quid pro quo arrangement. The resurgence of Hindutva was symbiotically linked to the changing needs of big capital in India, but the conditions for its emergence were situated on the plane of the social psyche. The idea of Hindu nationalism, though it had failed to capture the imagination of the nationalist struggle remained dormant and was nurtured by the various religious and social service organs, including the educational institutions built in tribal areas by RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the socio-cultural wing of the Parivar or family of Hindutva organizations and its offshoots. Hindutva had initially failed to elicit wide support during the national struggle, but it had persevered with its organizational program. The conceptual difference between the Hindutva of old and the new Hindutva lies in the displacement of an erstwhile anti-colonialism trying to attain hegemonic status by a majoritarian populism. Hindutva could now come clean about its ideology. It did not have to hesitatingly and sporadically construct the British colonialist as its other. The other could be openly stated as those professing faith in Islam, in a foreign religion, Islam, whose followers had invaded the land of the Hindus, so the story of Hindutva says. The false universal was the Hindu, defined only by difference with the followers of Islam, and of course, all others who followed religions with holy sites outside the geographical territory of India. Those who had the Punna view, Punna Bhu, as Savarkar says, the Holy Land elsewhere, that is outside the confines of India. Hindutva has prospered in recent times because of a variety of reasons located in the social psyche. First, the ideational force of Hindutva defined in opposition to Islam primarily. Second, perception of democratic deficit compensated by the emergence of a popular leader, Modi. Third, vigilante violence, extension of political society through the vigilantes, and the release of pent-up frustration through such violence. Violence against the other, providing substitute gratification to the population, defeated on all fronts, a sort of an orgiastic release, I would say, and also the use of ideological state apparatus. The popular support of the current regime is partly explained by the ideational force of Hindutva and partly by the iconic figure of Modi. The perception of democratic deficit has been the occasion for loss of faith in the very process of representative democracy and the emergence of a strongman-led populist governance the world over. This is based on the sense of direct representation of the disempowered non-elite through the figure of the popular people's leader. This found expression in India in the figure of Modi. It is a figure that transcends the normal citizen's yardstick for continued political endorsement, that is, performance of government. I have elsewhere theorized in a Bengali article, this is a kind of fetish that Marx talks about, the assignation of my desire to an object and surrendering to the object. Modi becomes a fetish figure to which is attributed all that the impoverished crave for, like the god of the religious fetish. The popularity of the regime is further heightened by the violent, impotent anger against the system that is displaced to fierce hatred of the other, designated by Hindutva as the Muslim. The anger finds orgiastic release in the Hindutva vigilantes' brutalities with which the docile, resigned, defeated, and deprived classes identified. An aspect of religious fundamentalism, of religious fundamentalist state power is that the violence of the state machinery is complemented by the violence of vigilante groups. In India, these are groups like the Ram Sene or Gaurakshak, the crowd protection organizations, that operate as extensions of state coercive machinery with open or implicit support from the state. While Muslims are the favored targets, modern westernized liberal youth as well as other minority communities like the LGBT are also routinely harassed and assaulted. These vigilante groups operate as extensions of state authority, especially in states run by the BJP, as there is rarely any censure of their activities by the governments. Identifying with the brutality of the vigilantes probably provides cathartic release for the defeated masses. As for the vigilantes themselves, their mob gives them an identity that transcends their banal, failed lives. Their brutality is perhaps the displaced expression of their repressed failures. Thus, there is a symbiotic reinforcement of three complementary forces: the ideational populism of Hindutva, fetishization of the leader Modi, who embodies a fetish, the unrepresented people, and the jouissance in the brutality of the vigilante wings of the Sangh Parivar. Additionally, BJP, having come to power, is using ideological state apparatus to maintain its popular hegemony. This is the organizational aspect of this religious fundamentalism. It is using syllabus reforms, control over educational institutions, particularly those administered by the central government, media control by crony capital, all to drive home the message of a glorious past of the Hindu nation before the advent of the Mughals, together with the anti-national character of Muslims, which has continuity with the propagated history of Mughal rapaciousness. I will conclude with this. We have not passed any blanket judgment on populism, which is the general tendency of the literature, as Laclau so meticulously documents. It is a socio-political phenomena that is real and not the result of a conspiracy, as we would be comfortable in believing. I do believe that the only way in which majoritarian populism can be countered is through mobilization for a laboring class project. The problem is that those who profess faith in this mobilization do not see this as a hegemonic project requiring sustained cultural work to build and project a universal. They would rather take refuge in the proletarian as embodiment of the universal, so that the only organizational work required is the organization of the working class. The other extreme that prevails in India is the equation of statism with socialism, which keeps no functional difference between the politics of the Congress party and that of the largest Marxist party in India. Thank you. These are the references. I have sent a PowerPoint to the university, but I have substantially changed it. So I will be sending this PowerPoint on, and I suppose it could be distributed among the participants so that the references are there, and also you can go through the entire thing again, and perhaps you can send me your reactions in a more detailed way. I've given you my email ID so that if you want to interact with me later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Basu, for this very original presentation, I must say. And let me open the floor now to discussion. So people can take a minute to think over it and jump in if they have any questions. Questions or comments? Yes, Onu, you want to ask something?
If others don't have any, otherwise I can come.
You please go ahead. Go ahead.
Pranab, just one thing. It was really an excellent, as usual, an excellent connection and angle you are bringing to hegemony, populism, fundamentalism. My only thought over here while I, kind of tend to fully agree with you actually. So I don't have any questions for you like that. I'm only wondering those two quotes that you brought out from Brahmabandhu Upadhyay and Savarkar. Um, uh, the role of Christianization and the role of the Christian mindset as the secret subterranean support, I would say. I'm also searching for words. As the secret subterranean support of what we are calling Hindutva today. Though it's speaking the language of Hindutva, Hindu majoritarianism, etc. But it is in search of monotheism. It is in search of a Jerusalem. It is in search of membership, formal membership, which Gandhi always problematized, which is why Gandhi is the real impediment in this journey, actually. He's the real hurdle, he's the real roadblock, actually. And it has to be made scriptural, written religion, more in tune with theology. So there is as if a secret subtext or anti-text of Christianization that is going on. Colonialism only brought secular Christianization to India. Court, church, university, classroom, medicine, hospital. It brought those. Now the time is to fully usher in the religious aspect of colonialism. We had seen conversions, but conversions are actually minor points. Conversions are not major points. What we need, because of your angle of hegemony, actually, what we need is that we must consent to a large-scale conversion of our life worlds. And is this the final Christianization of a non-Christian society?
May I?
Yeah. It's just a doubt.
Yeah,
It's just
thank you very much. Because,
and you opened it up by those two quotations.
You are actually articulating in a way I was probably thinking of, but in the context of so many other things. Now you're absolutely, I quite absolutely agree with you. You see, the point because I had to keep my lecture, as Anjan told me.
The clue was in your talk only.
No. Pranab, you discuss. You please go ahead.
Now you see, as I just mentioned in passing, you see, Hindutva, as you very correctly pointed out, it's a plural. I mean, it's not even a faith. It's a diverse set of philosophies, right? And you see, what are called the text, the ancient text. We can divide them into two parts, as I was suggesting. This is from T.P. Chattopadhyay, you well know, in the Gyan Kand and the Karma Kand. Now, what I think is that, you see, even for example, an atheist like me, I have gone through some of the Gyan Kand, and it is quite enriching in the sense that we can find some threads, philosophical threads with deconstructionism even, and that is very invigorating. Now, but this kind of search, which I'm sure you are involved in also, and so many of us do it either specifically for a purpose or just also out of curiosity. Now, this kind of practice that is trying to understand Hinduism as philosophies, diverse philosophies, This is quite different from what we mean by Hindu. Who is a Hindu? Nah, is a Hindu, the essentials of Hinduism. Who is a Hindu? Now, when you say who is a Hindu, what do? We identify. How well does he bow before, he or she bow before the gods? Do you give an Anjan? Now you see, these are the karma kand. That is, and very specifically, these are there in the Brahmanas. And you see, Brahmanas, the Brahmins. So it's a Brahminical religion, and that is why we have Kanchalaya saying that why I'm not a Hindu. Now, you see, this is precisely the point that I think we are both making, that Hinduism is not a religion. And because it is not
Yes.
a religion, you cannot have a organization. And when you talk of the church, it is a organization. Granted that there are various Christian sects, but each sect has its
Yes.
own church and its own organization. But Hinduism really doesn't have that kind of organization. So you talk of the Vedic church. Now there are so many quotes that one can cite to substantiate what you are saying, and this even it was not a proselytizing religion, but now we have this what ghar wapsi, na, returning home. So it's a kind of baptism. You're really doing a kind of
Yes.
baptism. So in a sense, our culture, you see, you're very correct that it previously modernization during the colonial period involved the import of Western values, Western education, and the secular cultural conduits, but
Icons. Icons.
icons. But now what we are having is, it is not the West that is bringing this in. Let us be clear. It is where the Hindutva, which sees that previously they tried to construct a nationalism, and if you construct a national, because I used to say very properly that Gandhi was the enemy of Hindutva, is the enemy that you have to face, you have to dismantle. And also, to a large extent, as you, Anjan, and you have written, also Rabindranath Tagore, but of course, he was not that popular. So, in
No.
that sense, he's not important to the political project. But Gandhi, of course, he never talked of he didn't believe in the state, the nation as such. It's the fragments. He perceived and so you have to build this nationalism, and you realize that in order to do that, the culture that you have to import is a monotheistic, is a very organized, unified culture. And this is not something which is indigenous to a country. As you correctly point out, this is the ultimate, uh, you can call it Christianization, you can call it Hebrewisation, whatever you call it.
Yes. Yes. I don't have a word for that. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And there, from the, can I add one line? Anjanda, can I add one line just?
Yes, yes,
From
go
the,
ahead.
your angle of hegemony there becomes very important. Because this is a quote unquote post-colonial society doing it to itself rather than colonial British rule doing it to us.
Absolutely.
So this is as if the let me put it this way, hegemony in the last instance, that it has really hegemony that is doing it now, and I will walk into my own servitude.
You see,
Nobody will.
I have a very fleeting notion which I have never explored really. That you see, when I was saying that there is bound to be an internal fracture between a bad universal and the particulars, and this comes out again and again. So you will be constructing a universal. Uh, what I can see, if I trace it historically, at one point of time we didn't have to think of a universal. We didn't
Yeah.
have to think of a nation. When we confronted colonialism in the nationalist struggle, we started think of a nationalism, but then came the figure of Gandhi,
Yeah.
as you argued in places, and also Partha has argued, a figure of Gandhi which dissipated the nationalism in a sense and still
Absolutely.
continued the anti-colonial fight.
Yes.
And
Yes.
now we have, so the universal was not there even in the nationalist struggle. The universal was not there. It was only in a negative sense, as I've said.
Yes.
against the British. And now, when you try to construct a universal, you always have to confront the differences. You always have to construct a bad universal. And having constructed a bad universal, there will be frictions within which will break it up. And then you construct another universal. I think this is how history will keep unfolding itself in the Indian context. And together with it, there, I think there is a political economic angle. I'm not, as
Yeah.
I've said, I'm
Of
not saying
course.
that they engineered it, but
Of
it, where we often tend to think of capitalism as nurturing liberalism, which is, of course, something totally false. No? It can survive in various kinds of governmental
Yeah.
practices. No?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Political
at
formation.
this current juncture, the big monopoly houses would rather have a fundamentalist, a majoritarian state than a liberal democratic state, because this is the state which can implement the labor code. This is a state which can do with the environmental code. A liberal government could not.
Thank you. Thank you, Pranab.
Pranab, let me, just before I give the floor to others, change the direction a little bit to the discussion. Uh, you, as you absolutely correctly pointed out, the crucial figure here, kind of the other big other, is the Muslim here in the construction of this consolidated unity you are talking about. Uh, uh, in this church or whatever you call it, but uh, what it has done, and this is where the political economy, this is just a comment, the first one, political economy aspect is crucial. It had enabled or it had helped defeat the working class, in the way, even in the way we knew it to be as an organized force. And even going further, it has in a way defeated the left, because the constituents of the left is the working class. So it it is just not a kind of the effect, if you talk about consequence, you talk about, uh, or perhaps even the design, if I may, of the universal, if I may talk about, is not just to project the Muslim as the other, but also perhaps to hegemonize the field, that other kinds of consolidated possibilities of other kinds of universal could be,
Yes.
uh,
Yes.
is it could be forever evacuated from the space. This is what I think is comes out in your presentation. One of the aspects. The other is two questions I have. Let me ask you the first question, which
Now,
I was.
I think on your, because these are all important points. Let me react to this.
Yes, please.
Then I'll
Please
take
go
this.
ahead.
Okay. So I think the way you're putting it, I would slightly disagree with it, because
Okay.
is there a conspiratorial bet? I'm
No, no,
saying
no.
that
I'm not
no.
saying that. No.
This is just a symbiotic thing, which is, and the reason, as I've said, that a large part of the reason lies with us, with the left. The left has never thought of hegemony. This is precisely the point that I want to make. Where other blocks have thought of the hegemony, Hindutva has really thought of the hegemony, but the left has never thought of hegemony. Nah. And the reason perhaps is that orthodox, as I've said, that I don't know. I think it is the orthodox left's belief in working class as the embodiment of human emancipation, and so you just keep organize the working class, and then in the organization also the problem is that unless you bring in the question of culture, a working class culture, this was never brought in. You see, unless you do that, what you do, you will only be able to organize the organized labor. The unorganized labor, you
Yes.
have to bring them and tell them what is the identity. You have to bring even the working class is a bad universal. It is a hegemonic concept.
Yes.
You have to drill the working class concept. You just can't say that, well, they are defined like that. So this,
Right,
we
right,
have
right.
brought it on ourselves.
Yes,
One.
yes. And Pranab, my slippage was on the word design. I should have
Yeah,
not
yeah,
used
yeah,
the word
yeah.
design. I didn't mean conspirators. You know that very well,
No,
actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
okay, yeah, go on.
one of the
Yeah,
question I had
question,
is,
question.
you talk about this ideation. Now, I remember I grew up in the Hindi heartland, and where RSS was, and previously Johnson was dominant here. Now, and it had certain kind of image, identity, and with certain segments. It was very clear. I'm talking about the 70s, you know. Uh, Now, as you point out, there is this process, through this process of hegemonization, there is also the process of appropriation, the way it deals with the Dalits, the way it deals with the Adivasis. As you pointed out, that had already also gone a substantial shift. So my question to you is, this hegemonic in the ideation form, is then the Hindutva also a kind of floating signifier, in the sense that, you know, it's all empty, in the sense, not empty completely, but incomplete, in the sense that depending upon the situation or to complete the project, you are going to bring in newer and newer constituencies and change the meaning of Hindutva, you know. Well, you know, one of the success perhaps of this hegemonization is how it has been able to build and penetrate itself in constituencies that it previously did not have that kind of hold, you know. And so, you know, ideation is this ideation or unity or whatever your hegemony, is it for you? This is just to explain to us a little bit, you know. Is it a process also in the making?
Well, I think again, I would not be able to argue my position very forcefully, but it is my strong belief that no, ideational unity is a given unity. It is the faith in the Brahminical Hinduism, and the co-option, like say our president, the co-option is a very calculated move. You see, I just from my little personal experiences, which I have as a result of being able to visit certain places because of my daughters working in these tribal areas, NGO. You see, there, for example, I don't know whether it will be unconstitutional, but you see, our president is belongs to 2 or 3 families in that district among the Dalits who practice vegetarianism. There is a move afoot, I forget the name of the organization. It is a Hindutva organization, belongs to the Parivar, largely funded by British funds from NRI Indians, which has been ashrams and it teaches teaching the tribals to discard non-vegetarian food. Now, this is of course something which the NGOs find very undesirable, in the sense that because this is a very animal protein is the only form of nutrition protein that they get, because other forms of proteins are not affordable. Now, I'm saying that, you see, this co-option. When you are co-opting the Dalit, you are molding the Dalit to the Brahminical ways, and this is why you see Kanchalaya says that why I'm not a Hindu. I do believe that, and you go through Golwalkar, Savarkar, Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, anyone, you find that they are very staunch believers in the caste system. Now, this is something there. I think it's a bit of a conspiracy. When I was talking of the organizational aspects, I said that this is at a lower theoretical plane because it doesn't deal with the psyche. This is at the level of the organization. Organization, of course, is a conspiracy. Any organization is. Now, so this extension of the ashram schools in the tribal areas, and they do a lot of good work. Let us not forget, they do a lot of good work in the sense that access to other kinds of educational institutions is non-existent in a lot of tribal areas. So these Ekal Vidyalayas, etc., etc. So, but this is, they are not doing it for the reason that out of generosity. They are doing it. They have done it for decades now, from since independence. They have done it in order to bring in the Dalits within the fold. And you will remember that there is strong reason to believe that the Gujarat violence, a large part of it was done by the Dalits themselves. So, but I don't think that the Hindutva is a floating signifier. Hindutva is very definitely Brahminical, I think. I'm not able to argue this position very openly.
No, no, no. I mean, this is actually very important, and in a sense, to a large extent, I agree with you. Just wanted to bring this point out,
Yeah, yeah.
and
No,
in
this
fact,
is important.
one must emphasize. I think I don't know whether there is anything of comparison. I remember Steve Bannon, who was considered the mastermind of how the person on the who was kind of the figure who initiated Trump, implanted Donald Trump in the American center stage. Uh, Bannon, in fact, said in 2014, I remember, I have that quote actually somewhere, that the RSS and Modi is an example for us. So we think Modi is a second-rate Trump or something like that. No, it's the other way around. Actually, this was so innovative and important. This kind of shift, or this kind of practice by the right was so important that it had an impact, I think, all over the world. So, as you correctly point out, Modi is not just an kind of a figure in India, but it's a global, has emerged as a global figure, kind of the likes of which we never had since Gandhi. It's a kind of a, it tells you something about the success, as you referred.
And parallelly, you see, Modi is a manifestation of a general phenomena which is appearing the world over now.
Absolutely, global influence.
You have
And
Modi
that's why
Trump, you have
he
Modi
is,
Putin.
that tells you why he is so popular also, to
Yeah.
a large extent, globally also. Now, let me just open it for if others have any questions or queries or comments, please jump in.
Can I add a line to this, Anjan?
Yes.
The discussion you and Pranab had just now. Just uh, not a very serious line. Pranab, actually, in Marxism, we thought we will reach state power and then work on hegemony. The history of the RSS is that it has worked on hegemony without meddling much with state power, even today, actually. It doesn't matter nearly, quote unquote, who is in the state, but the hegemony must continue. Exactly what Pranab was saying about the schools, about developmental activities, about support systems. The hegemony is as if prior to state power, whereas in Marxism we kind of, I think, read also Gramsci in a particular way, not wrong way or right way, that state power is first and hegemony will follow.
The problem is, of course, that we can use various texts in Marx and Gramsci to support that kind of reading which you are probably criticizing. But also, there are so many texts in Marx and Gramsci which would support the kind of thing that we are propagating, we believe in. So, in fact, as I said, that I was quite stunned to read that passage in German ideology, where Marx very clearly says that you have to build a cultural, you have to be, no, he doesn't use the word hegemony, but cultural unity before you can think of the revolution. That unless you have this, you can't do it. It's very clear. And the RSS, of course, you see this, I think that Marxism, again, this would be a very strong statement like the other one I made, that any organization is a conspiracy. This would again be a very strong statement that Marxism uh, has not emerged as an ideational concept in some sense. It has remained a rather empirical concept, like working class. You identify the working class, put them together, and then you have
Yes.
Marxist practice. Now,
Yes.
the Marxist ideology, the ideational force. You see, the RSS believes in where does this commitment come from? That they are really very committed, and they sacrifice. Self-sacrifice is great. These people who live in the tribal areas and build these schools. They spend their lives there. No?
Yes. Yes. In
No,
fact, from the
Something
one
like
line.
Shankar Duryogi, na? When you say
Yes.
Shankar
Yes.
Duryogi was the only example we have.
Only
Also,
example.
Ikera to an example
Mhm.
to some extent.
Yes. Like the RSS is as if renunciate of power, but and in India the renunciate works very well actually.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
Gandhi, renunciate of power, but uh, completely committed to hegemonic cultural, contingent universals or whatever they are doing. That's complex, but the hegemonic is more important than power. Yeah,
in fact,
carry on.
just to make the point, I remember Bharatiya Janata Party or BJP was only officially formed in 1984, actually. I think something like that was the date.
Mm.
Before that, there are different versions.
Yes.
So when I was talking about where I grew up in, everybody knew RSS. And everybody knew the person who was RSS. But,
The
who
political
was
thing was
Jung
not that
Sang,
important.
sometimes Jung Sang is there, not there, it didn't matter
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah.
That was the basis, in schools, akhadas, and all those places, in the political practice, in the social practice, actually.
Yes,
So that
Anjan.
the
This
issue of,
renunciation,
yeah, I think
yeah,
the
this
issue of,
renunciation that just a second, the
yeah,
renunciation that Anup was talking about, the asceticism, if I may say so. You see, very little. The only thing I read uh, about Brahmo Bandhav was from two volumes written by someone called Lipna, of whom I little know very little. Now, you see, but Brahmo Bandhav, we don't, we have reference to Brahmo Bandhav, some discussion about Brahmo Bandhav in Ashish Nandi, of course,
Yes,
in the
yes.
context of Govindnath.
Psychological double of Tagore. Yeah.
Yeah. But you see, he is the iconic figure. Na? He is a person wearing saffron robes and a
Yes,
rosary. Uh,
yes, yes.
that is something. That is really something.
The ascetic,
Yeah,
और सत्ता की लालच नहीं है. Sorry for the
yeah,
Hindi, but
absolute,
this
absolute,
can only
absolute.
be said in this way. In this way, yeah. So which Anjana was also pointing out. Please carry on. Sorry, I'll
okay,
stop
okay,
now.
yeah, okay. Other people jump in. If you have any questions or comments or anything. Okay. I think if others have any question, we will get the slide. And Professor Basu has already given his email. So kindly write your comments or questions to Professor Basu, because this is a very pertinent and fertile and you know, very topical discussion. It's just not for discussion, but really, this is a discussion we cannot but have for our own future, in the next, 10, 20 years, and it is one thing we talked about this earlier, about lamenting about the left. We know, and Professor Basu has reiterated it, the problem that the opportunity that the left had, and the opportunity that was lost actually in the failure to give importance to culture and hegemonization process. But it is also a question of for us to rethink uh, from India, but with a global connotation, with a global, uh, perhaps significance as to how we are going to think of an alternative route. These the counter hegemonic or call it going to come from something like the Gandhian experiment, or is it going to come from another ideation force, or do we need a third angle or a different angle to it? I think this is
Yes.
undoubtedly uh, been Lenin talked about what to do. Okay, we know what not to do, and what we had missed out. Actually, we now have, I think, sufficient understanding. That is why we are discussing these issues here in this particular cluster. One of the major point of this cluster is to discuss the alternatives here. And therefore, I think this is a crucial question that will stay with us. Thank you, Professor Basu, for sharing your thought as
Thank you
usual,
for
in a
giving me
very,
this opportunity.
yeah, in a very original way. I hope it has been helpful to you.
Very
So,
original.
It has been very helpful, but I'm hoping that there will be further reactions
yes,
consented
yes,
by mail.
yes. Let us
And
give
of
some
course,
time. I think
Pranab
there
and
will.
Anjan, we can carry on our conversation.
Yeah, of course, no doubt. All right. So I think
Thank you all.
we will now,
Thank you.
we will now end this discussion.